Welcome to your deep dive into globalization. You've given us a really fascinating mix of sources, academic excerpts, news articles, and quite a lot focusing on China. I'm really curious to see where this takes us.
It's a great choice, especially with so much happening right now. Globalization isn't just some abstract idea. It's shaping our daily lives in ways we might not even realize.
Exactly. So our mission today is to go beyond just the headlines. Let's understand how globalization really works the good, the bad, and maybe even the surprising. We'll be digging into things like how countries try to balance attracting foreign investment while still protecting their own interests, and whether globalization makes cultures more alike or actually helps preserve them.
And I think the story of Jack Ma, the founder of Alibaba, will be a perfect example of how these global forces play out in the real world. His rise and fall are incredibly revealing about China's unique approach to globalization.
Oh, absolutely. His story is almost like a modern-day fable, right? You've got this guy who fails his university entrance exams twice, gets rejected from tons of jobs, even KFC, but then goes on to found this massive e-commerce empire. We're talking Alibaba, basically China's Amazon, but even bigger.
To put it into perspective, just think about this. Alibaba's online marketplace offers close to 1 billion products. 1 billion. And then there's Alipay, with over 700 million monthly users. That's more than twice the entire population of the U.S.
It's mind-blowing how quickly China's economy has grown, and a lot of people point to the private sector as a key driver of that growth.
It's true. China's private sector contributes a whopping 60% of its GDP and employs 80% of its urban workers. But Jack Ma's story also shows us the limits of that economic liberalization.
Right, because even though he was the celebrated entrepreneur, things took a dramatic turn when he dared to criticize the Chinese government.
His comments about the government stifling innovation were seen as a challenge to the Communist Party's authority. And you can't do that in China, even if you're a billionaire.
So what happened? Did they throw him in jail?
Not quite, but the consequences were swift and severe. The government pulled the plug on the IPO of his fintech company, Ant Group, just days before it was supposed to launch.
Wow, I bet that sent shockwaves through the financial world.
Absolutely. This was supposed to be the biggest IPO in history, valued at $37 billion. But it was abruptly canceled. And then Ma basically disappeared from public view for a while. He went from being this flamboyant showman to practically a recluse.
That's crazy. So even with all his success, he was still ultimately subject to the party's control. I guess that's a stark reminder that China plays by its own rules.
It certainly highlights the unique dynamics at play in China.
Yeah.
And this brings us to a broader discussion about globalization itself. Ma's experience is just one example of how global forces interact with national interests and political systems.
Okay, so let's back up a bit. Before we get too deep into those interactions, how would you actually define globalization? What does it really mean?
At its core, globalization is about interconnectedness. It's the increasing flow of goods, services, capital, people, and even ideas across national borders. Think of it like this. It's making the world a smaller place, at least in terms of how easily things can move around.
Right, so it's not just about companies like McDonald's and Starbucks popping up everywhere. It's much bigger than that.
Exactly. We're talking about economies becoming intertwined, supply chains spanning continents, and technologies connecting people instantly across the globe.
So when we talk about globalization, we often hear about things like foreign direct investment and trade. What do those terms actually mean in practice?
Well, foreign direct investment, or FDI, is when a company invests in building a factory, setting up a business, or acquiring assets in another country. It's about putting down roots in a foreign market.
So like if a German car company builds a manufacturing plant in the U.S., that would be FDI, right?
Exactly. And trade, of course, is the exchange of goods and services between countries.
Right, which seems to have been growing like crazy. Like, isn't there way more trade happening now than, say, 50 years ago?
You're absolutely right. The amount of trade happening globally has exploded in recent decades. Just look at this. In 1980, trade accounted for about 30% of global GDP. By 2010, it had surged to a whopping 56%. That's almost double.
Wow, that's a massive increase. So what's driving that? Is it just that it's cheaper to manufacture things in other countries?
That's definitely part of it. But it's also due to things like advances in transportation and communication technology, as well as the reduction of trade barriers thanks to agreements between countries.
Okay, and this brings us back to the companies that are actually doing business across borders, multinational corporations, or MNCs as they're often called. I mean, we're surrounded by them, right? Our phones, clothes, even the coffee we drink.
They are everywhere. And they've become incredibly sophisticated at adapting their products and marketing strategies to local tastes. Remember that McDonald's in China with the German sausage double beef burger?
Oh, yeah. It sounds kind of bizarre, but I guess that's the point, right? To appeal to local preferences. But I'm curious, are MNCs ultimately a good thing or a bad thing?
That's a complex question, and there's no easy answer. It really depends on how they operate and how governments regulate them. I mean, there are some definite potential benefits. MNCs can bring in much-needed capital, create jobs, and even help transfer knowledge and skills to developing countries.
So it's not all doom and gloom.
Not at all. But there are also potential downsides, like the profits often flowing back to the MNC's home country rather than staying in the developing country where they're operating. There's also the risk of exploitation, with companies seeking out the cheapest labor and the most lax environmental regulations.
Which is where the term race to the bottom comes in, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
This is when countries compete for foreign investment by lowering labor standards, environmental protections, and even taxes, all in the hopes of attracting those big MNCs.
It sounds like it could create a pretty unhealthy dynamic, with countries being pressured to compromise on important things just to attract investment.
Absolutely. That's why it's so important for governments to have policies in place to protect their workers and the environment, even as they're trying to attract foreign capital.
So it's not just about opening up to the global market and hoping for the best. There needs to be a plan, right?
Definitely. And it's not just about national governments. There are also international organizations that play a role in shaping the global economy.
You're talking about groups like the World Bank, the IMF, and the WTO.
Exactly. These organizations are often involved in promoting economic liberalization and free trade. They provide loans and technical assistance to developing countries and can sometimes impose conditions on those loans.
So they have a lot of influence, huh? But I'm guessing not everyone is thrilled about their involvement.
That's right. These organizations have been criticized for sometimes imposing policies that primarily benefit wealthy countries or corporations, rather than truly helping developing countries.
So it's not as simple as just free trade is good for everyone.
It's definitely more complicated than that. There are always winners and losers in any economic system. And then there are the supranational organizations like the European Union, which take this a step further.
Oh, right. I've heard about that. Isn't that where member countries actually give up some of their own power to make decisions?
Exactly. It's about pooling sovereignty in certain areas to achieve shared goals, like economic integration and political cooperation.
And what are some examples of that? Like, how does that actually play out in the real world?
Well, one of the most notable examples is the euro, the single currency adopted by many EU member states. By joining the Eurozone, these countries have effectively ceded control over their monetary policy to the European Central Bank.
So they can't just print more money whenever they want.
No, those decisions are made at the EU level, not by individual countries. And this loss of control over certain policies was a major factor in the UK's decision to leave the EU, which we know as Brexit.
Right. So giving up some level of national sovereignty is a big deal, and not everyone is on board with that. But it's interesting to see how these supranational organizations are trying to tackle global challenges that go beyond the capacity of any single nation.
It's definitely a trend to watch.
Uh-huh.
But as we've seen with both the Jack Ma story and the EU example, globalization doesn't just happen in a vacuum. There's constant push and pull between global forces and national interests, between powerful institutions and individual citizens.
And speaking of citizens, I'm guessing they haven't just been sitting back and passively accepting all these changes, right?
You're absolutely right. In fact, some of the most powerful responses to globalization have come from the grassroots level.
Like those massive protests against the WTO in Seattle back in 1999.
Exactly. That was a pivotal moment. It really brought the anti-globalization movement into the spotlight. And it showed the world that people weren't going to just blindly accept the perceived negative consequences of globalization.
And since then, technology has made it even easier for people to connect and organize across borders, right?
Absolutely. Social media platforms have become powerful tools for transnational activism, allowing groups to share information, coordinate protests, and pressure governments and corporations on a global scale.
So it's given a voice to people who might otherwise have been marginalized or silenced?
Exactly. It's been especially valuable for groups in authoritarian states where freedom of speech is restricted. They can now bypass traditional media and communicate directly with the world.
That's incredible. And it's not just about protesting. Technology has also enabled people to preserve and share their cultures in ways that were never possible before.
That's a really important point. We often think of globalization as this homogenizing force, making everything the same. But it's also created new opportunities for cultural exchange and preservation.
Like how? Can you give me some examples?
Now, think about online platforms for language learning. They connect people from all over the world and help preserve languages that might otherwise be disappearing. Or virtual museum tours, which allow anyone, anywhere, to experience the art and history of different cultures.
That's so cool. It seems like technology can be both a force for homogenization and a tool for cultural preservation, depending on how it's used.
Exactly. And this brings us to a question I'd like you to consider. How do you see globalization impacting your own cultural experiences?
That's a great question. I think it's definitely made me more aware of different cultures and perspectives. I love being able to try food from all over the world, listen to music from different countries, and connect with people from different backgrounds. But I also worry about the potential for cultural homogenization.
That's a valid concern, and I think it highlights the importance of being mindful of how we engage with globalization, both as individuals and as societies.
So it's not just about economics and politics, it's about culture, identity, and how we see ourselves in relation to the rest of the world.
Precisely. And this is where it gets really interesting. Because as technology continues to evolve at an incredible pace, it's going to raise all sorts of new questions about the future of globalization.
It's fascinating to think about how technology is shaping our experience of globalization, both in terms of cultural exchange and even the way we organize and protest.
It's a powerful tool that can amplify both the positive and negative aspects of globalization. And this brings us to an important point, the impact of globalization on state sovereignty. It's a complex issue, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts on it.
Well, I've heard some people argue that globalization is going to lead to the end of the nation state, that countries will become irrelevant in this increasingly interconnected world. But honestly, I'm not sure I buy that. It seems like states are still the main players on the global stage.
I agree. It's an oversimplification to say that the nation-state is dead. But globalization has undoubtedly created new challenges for states, shifting the balance of power in subtle but profound ways.
Can you give me some examples of how that's happening?
Well, let's consider the role of multinational corporations. These companies often have vast resources and operate across multiple countries,
Yeah.
giving them significant leverage over governments. They can play countries off against each other, threatening to move their operations to places with lower taxes or weaker environmental regulations.
So it's like a game of chicken with countries being pressured to compromise on things like labor standards or environmental protections just to attract investment.
That's a good analogy. It puts governments in a tough spot. They need to balance the potential economic benefits of foreign investment with the need to protect their citizens and the environment.
It sounds like a delicate balancing act, especially for developing countries that might be more vulnerable to this kind of pressure.
Exactly. And then there's the impact of global financial markets, which have become increasingly interconnected and volatile. Money can move across borders at lightning speed, making it harder for governments to control their own economies.
So if a country does something that spooks investors, they could see a sudden flight of capital potentially triggering an economic crisis.
Precisely. That's why governments often feel compelled to adopt policies that are seen as favorable to global markets, even if those policies aren't necessarily in the best interests of their own citizens.
So it seems like globalization is both empowering and constraining starts at the same time. It gives them access to new markets and opportunities, but it also limits their ability to act independently.
That's a really astute observation. It's this constant push and pull between global forces and national interests that makes globalization such a fascinating and complex phenomenon.
And it's not just about economics, right? It seems like globalization also has profound implications for culture and politics.
Absolutely. We've talked about how technology can both homogenize and diversify cultures, but there are also political dimensions to this. For example, some argue that globalization is leading to a decline in national identity as people increasingly identify with global movements or causes.
So you might have someone who feels more connected to climate activists in another country than they do to their own neighbors.
Exactly. And this can pose a challenge to traditional notions of citizenship and political participation. It also raises questions about who is responsible for addressing global issues like climate change or poverty. Is it the nation state, or is it some kind of global governing body?
That's a really interesting question. I mean, it seems like these global problems require global solutions, but getting countries to cooperate on that scale can be incredibly difficult.
It certainly can. We've seen this with issues like climate change, where international agreements are often watered down to the lowest common denominator because countries are unwilling to compromise their own national interests.
So even though globalization is making the world more interconnected, it's not necessarily making it more cooperative.
That's a good point. And this tension between cooperation and competition is something that's playing out at all levels of the global system, between states, between corporations, and even between individuals.
And it brings us back to how citizens are responding to all of this. We talked about the protests in Seattle back in 1999, but it seems like that was just the beginning.
It was a watershed moment. But the anti-globalization movement has continued to evolve in the years since then. We've seen the rise of new groups and movements focused on issues like fair trade, environmental justice, and labor rights.
And technology has played a huge role in amplifying these voices, right?
Absolutely. Social media platforms have made it easier than ever for activists to connect with each other, share information, and mobilize people across borders. It's given rise to a new era of transnational activism.
So you might have a group in, say, Nigeria, working with a group in Brazil to pressure a multinational corporation that's operating in both countries.
Exactly. These networks can be incredibly effective at raising awareness, organizing boycotts, and even influencing government policy.
And it's not just about protesting or resisting globalization, right? Some groups are using technology to promote cultural exchange and understanding.
You're absolutely right. We see this with online platforms that connect people from different cultures, facilitate language learning, or promote tourism.
Like those virtual museum tours we talked about earlier, it's a way of experiencing the world from your living room.
Exactly. It's these kinds of initiatives that show the potential of globalization to foster cross-cultural dialogue and understanding.
So it's not all doom and gloom. There's hope for a more positive and inclusive form of globalization.
I believe there is. But it's going to require a conscious effort from individuals, governments, and international organizations to shape a more just, equitable, and sustainable global system.
It sounds like we need to move beyond this idea of globalization as just an economic force and start thinking about its social, cultural, and political implications.
I completely agree. And that's why I think it's so important for us to have these kinds of conversations, to grapple with these complex issues and explore different perspectives.
Well, I'm certainly learning a lot from this deep dive. It's given me a much deeper understanding of how globalization is shaping the world around us.
I'm glad to hear that. And I think the next step is to look at some specific examples of how different countries are navigating the challenges and opportunities of globalization.
Okay, so let's get into that. What are some of the countries you think would be interesting to explore?
Well, there are so many to choose from, but I think the UK is a good place to start. They've been through a rather dramatic experience with Brexit, which offers a lot of insights into the tensions between national sovereignty and global integration.
Yeah, Brexit was a huge deal. And it seems like it was driven, at least in part, by this sense that the UK had given up too much control to the European Union.
Exactly. Some people felt that the EU was too bureaucratic and undemocratic,
Hmm.
and that it was imposing rules and regulations that were harmful to the UK economy. They wanted to take back control, as the Brexit campaign slogan put it.
So it was a rejection of this idea of supranational authority, of ceding power to a larger entity.
In many ways, yes. And it's a sentiment that we're seeing in other parts of the world, as well as people push back against what they see as the excesses of globalization.
It's interesting how this desire for local control is happening at the same time that the world is becoming more interconnected.
It is a bit of a paradox, but I think it speaks to the fundamental tensions at the heart of globalization. On the one hand, you have this force for integration, for breaking down barriers and connecting people across borders. On the other hand, you have this equally powerful force for differentiation, for preserving local cultures and identities.
And it seems like technology is playing a role in both of those trends.
Absolutely. It's facilitating both the flow of goods and ideas across borders and the resurgence of local movements and identities.
So it's not a simple story, is it? Globalization is this complex, multifaceted phenomenon that's playing out in different ways all over the world.
Exactly. And to really understand it, we need to look at specific examples to see how different countries and communities are grappling with these challenges and opportunities.
Well, I'm definitely curious to hear more about those examples. Where do you want to go next?
Let's move south of the border and take a look at Mexico. They've embraced globalization through trade agreements like NAFTA, which has had a significant impact on their economy. But it's also been a source of controversy and social unrest.
Oh, yeah. I remember learning about the Zapatista uprising in Chiapas back in 1994. That was a direct response to NAFTA, wasn't it?
That's right. The Zapatistas, an indigenous rebel group, saw NAFTA as a symbol of globalization's negative consequences. They argued that it would benefit wealthy elites and foreign corporations at the expense of indigenous communities and small farmers.
So it was a case of globalization exacerbating existing inequalities.
In many ways, yes. And while NAFTA has led to increased trade and investment in Mexico, it's also contributed to a widening gap between rich and poor.
It seems like finding the right balance between economic integration and social equity is one of the key challenges of globalization.
I completely agree, and it's something that countries all over the world are struggling with.
Okay, so we've looked at the UK, which is kind of stepping back from globalization with Brexit and Mexico, which has embraced it through trade agreements. What about a country that's maybe somewhere in between?
How about Nigeria? It's Africa's most populous country and a major oil producer, so it's deeply integrated into the global economy. But it also faces significant challenges like poverty, corruption, and environmental degradation.
It sounds like a microcosm of the promises and pitfalls of globalization.
Exactly. Nigeria has attracted significant foreign investment, particularly in the oil sector, but much of that wealth hasn't trickled down to the average citizen. And oil extraction has also taken a toll on the environment, leading to protests and social unrest.
So it's a reminder that globalization isn't just about abstract economic forces. It has real-world consequences for people and the planet.
Absolutely. And it's crucial that we don't lose sight of those human and environmental dimensions as we navigate this increasingly complex global landscape.
Well, you've given me a lot to think about. It's clear that globalization is a powerful force, but it's not an unstoppable one. The choices we make, both individually and collectively, will determine its ultimate impact.
I couldn't agree more. And I think the more we understand about the dynamics of globalization, the better equipped we'll be to shape a more just and sustainable future.
It's amazing how much globalization varies from country to country. It's not just one big wave washing over everyone the same way.
Absolutely. Each nation's history, political system, and even cultural values influence how they engage with globalization.
Yeah.
And speaking of distinct approaches, we can't leave out China. We've already touched on Jack Ma's story, but there's so much more to unpack about their model.
Right. They've become this economic powerhouse, but they definitely play by their own rules.
Their system is often described as state capitalism. It's this fascinating blend of economic liberalization and tight political control, which has allowed them to achieve incredible economic growth while maintaining a one-party system.
But that also raises some concerns about human rights and freedom of speech, right? Like, how much individual liberty are people willing to sacrifice for economic prosperity?
That's a crucial question, and one that's becoming increasingly relevant as China's global influence grows. They're challenging the traditional Western model of globalization, which often emphasizes democracy and individual rights.
It seems like their approach is more about economic pragmatism and national strength.
Exactly. And it's proving to be a compelling alternative for some developing countries who are disillusioned with the Western model or who prioritize rapid economic growth above all else.
So it's not just a matter of choosing between being for or against globalization. There are different versions of it, different ways of engaging with the global system.
Precisely. And as we move forward, I think we're going to see even more diversity in how countries approach globalization. There's no one-size-fits-all solution.
It's like that saying, think globally, act locally. Maybe it's about finding the right balance between global integration and local autonomy.
I think that's a really insightful way to put it. It's about harnessing the benefits of globalization while mitigating its risks. And that's going to require careful consideration and strategic decision-making.
And it's not just up to governments, right? We've talked about how citizens are playing an increasingly active role in shaping the future of globalization, whether through activism, cultural exchange, or simply by making informed choices about the products they buy and the companies they support.
Absolutely. We all have a role to play in this. And I think the more we understand about the dynamics of globalization, the better equipped we'll be to make those choices and influence the direction of this complex and ever-evolving process.
This deep dive has definitely given me a lot to think about. I feel like I have a much deeper understanding of how globalization is impacting the world, and more importantly, how I can engage with it in a more informed and thoughtful way.
That's fantastic to hear. And remember, this is just the beginning. There's so much more to explore, so many different perspectives to consider. I encourage you to continue learning and asking questions, and to use this knowledge to make a positive impact on the world.
I'm definitely going to do that. Thanks for guiding me through this deep dive. It's been a truly enlightening experience.
It was my pleasure.
You
Until
are.
next time.